edition. I am Eric Toshalis, the Research Director for the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative, which is a Students at the Center initiative and part of Jobs for the Future. I am delighted that we have such a great turnout today. We're close to 150 people who have registered, and that's not including the numbers who will access this once we upload it and make it available for free and widely publicize it on our website, studentsatthecenterhub.org. So what I would like to do is quickly introduce our speaker for the day, and then give you a quick outline for how the webinar will go, and then I will hand off the presentational tools to Dr. Fredricks. So first, a quick introduction. Jennifer Fredricks is currently the professor in the Department of Human Development at Connecticut College. She's also one of our Students at the Center Distinguished Fellows. She has a long history of leading the field and understanding how students initiate and sustain engagement in learning environments, particularly in secondary school settings, although to some extent also in the elementary school settings. She's published widely, both research books and books for research articles and books and professional development materials for a wide range of audiences, speaking both to researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. She's a key leader in thinking through thorny problems and how to understand what engagement looks like, what it sounds like, and how we can both measure it and then support it in rich environmental or rich educational environments. She's also just a real pleasure to work with, as I'm sure you'll all see very shortly. And then one quick update about Dr. Fredricks is that she's recently just been appointed the new Dean of Academic Departments and Programs at Union College in Schenectady, New York. So I know you all will join me in congratulating her on that appointment. I'm sure that Union College is really excited about her leadership and scholarship and what it can do for their institution. So, and as sad as Connecticut College may be to lose her. But we're delighted to have her here for you today. If we can advance the slide, I can show you a little bit about what we're going to be doing in today's flow of activities. First, we'll have Jennifer present a wide range of really important material to help building level leaders, educators, systems level leaders, and even state policymakers think about how we might be using engagement to address ESSA fifth requirements. There's some really rich information here that will be helpful. Then at the end, we'll have some audience Q&A, and it'll be kind of my job in consultation with Melanie Mulvey, our program manager, who is sort of running the system behind the scenes here. We'll be curating some questions that you feel free to chat them anytime you want in the field in the lower right-hand corner of the WebEx interface there. Anytime questions come up for you, please go ahead and put them there, and we'll be curating them as we go along. And then at the end, I will pick and choose from some of those questions in consultation with our other Students at the Center Distinguished Fellows who may be on the call to help us think about which questions would be most pertinent for our multiple audiences. And then at the end, we'll kick it back to Jennifer to give some concluding remarks and offer a hint at what resources we'll be uploading in the next week or two when we upload this webinar to the website. So with that, I will welcome Dr. Fredricks from Connecticut College, soon to be from Union College, and hand off the presentational tools to her. Dr. Fredricks. Currently not getting any audio from Dr. Fredricks, so 1 second here while we make sure we have the right buttons pressed. Jennifer, I'm not hearing you. 1 second. Now I'm hearing you, Jennifer. You're all good.
Okay. Okay, so I'm happy to be here and so glad there's so many other people who are interested in measurement. I love measurement, and so I want to share with you some of what I know about student engagement and how that may inform as you're thinking about measuring non-cognitive skills. This webinar really grew out of a desire to give educators, administrators, and policymakers more information on measuring student engagement as they're devising their accountability systems as part of ESSA. Okay. In response to concerns that MCLB resulted in too strong an emphasis on standardized test scores, one of the components of ESSA is that accountability systems need a fifth indicator of success beyond a test score. The only two stipulations are that these measures need to be valid, reliable, and comparable across states, and they need to allow for meaningful differentiation in school performance. What I'm going to try to articulate is that is a higher bar to meet. We do a good job in achievement test scores, but that's a much higher bar to meet for some of these non-cognitive indicators. Some examples that they suggest, and student engagement is what I know the most about, so I'll talk about that, but many of the points I make fit these other ones. Also, student access to advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, and school climate. Okay, why is this? First, I want to frame, well, why would we want to do this, and then talk about some of the issues with measuring these indicators, and then offer some cautionary notes. So first, why should we move beyond test scores? Well, the first reason is what we choose to measure sends important signals about what we value. Right now, students, teachers, parents, and the public are getting the message that doing well on a relatively narrow summative assessment is a sign of success. So if we want to broaden the criteria of how we define success in schools, we need to broaden our measures. Second, our current accountability system has led to a narrowing of the curriculum, and in some cases, teachers teaching to the test. So this has meant that the content and types of thinking that are not captured by these traditional standardized tests are not being fostered in many classrooms. Third, many of these non-cognitive skills, including engagement, persistence, and social emotional learning, are really the skills that are necessary to be successful in more student-centered learning environments, which is really what our reforms are asking us to do. So environments where students are taking more ownership of their learning, they really need these skills to be successful. Fourth, we know while it's important to move beyond these indicators, we know that from research on engagement that myself and others have done, that engagement is predictive of higher achievement test scores, higher grades, better academic outcomes. So focusing on engagement and these other non-cognitive skills can be a route to get to higher achievement. And finally, we know that these are the skills, these non-cognitive skills, that students need to be successful in the college, careers, and communities of the future. So if we really want to prepare students for learning environments and life after school, we need a stronger indicator of success and move beyond test scores. So what are we doing now? Well, student engagement, let me move. I just got very far ahead, okay. Sorry, I'm moving. Okay, so I'm missing an overhead, but so I will kind of, okay. So my overheads are a little out of order, but first I want to go through, Ed Week did an initial overview of what the 12 states have already submitted their initial ESSA plans. And if we look at those indicators, we see that student engagement does fit in those indicators. So the most common indicator in all of these states was chronic absenteeism, which is an indicator of disengagement, and attendance, which is an indicator of behavioral engagement. And attendance and chronic absenteeism, it's not surprising that these indicators are included because this is data that is already being collected by schools and does pass the first two tests for the criteria of inclusion. Another indicator of behavioral engagement that has been included in some of these plans is ninth grade on-track success. I'd like to argue that it's less clear if that's a valid and reliable indicator. Also, two of the states have used school climate survey data, either they've collected through surveys or observations. And school climate is one of the most heavily researched concepts in education. It encompasses aspects of interpersonal relationships, peer-to-peer and adult student relationships, and the quality of this relationship is an indicator of emotional engagement. Unfortunately, however, many of these school climate measures fail to pass the first criteria for inclusion. It's such a broad term, and there are very few valid and reliable measures that can be used to compare across states. Other measures that have been included are college and career readiness and physical fitness. Okay, so I'll go backwards. What is student engagement? So student engagement is one of those indicators that I think makes sense in an accountability system, but first we need to know what it means, and there is some debate in the field of even what is student engagement. That's something I've thought a lot about. But when we think about student engagement, it's important to think about it as a multi-dimensional construct that includes 3 different aspects. One is behavioral aspect, and that seems to get the most attention, so that's indicators of involvement in classroom tasks, their attendance or absenteeism, participation at the school level, and not getting in trouble or absence of disruptive behavior. Emotional engagement, those are indicators of their positive and negative reactions to the school, whether they like school, whether they're interested in school, and a notion of school belonging, which is really this, am I feel connected to the school institution? Do I feel connected to my peers and my teachers? And those indicators are in many of the school climate surveys. And finally, there's a cognitive dimension. So that means a deeper psychological investment in learning. So using deep strategies to really learn and understand the material versus what many students are doing in schools is only learning information for a test, for a task, and not really retaining that information deeply. There's also cognitive engagement also focuses on being metacognitive, which is I'm thinking about my own thinking. I'm planning my thinking. I'm evaluating and monitoring my thinking. And finally, there's a notion of strategy use. Am I using deep strategies to learn and understand the material, or am I just using the strategies to be able to regurgitate the material for a test? Again, there's been a tendency to focus on these behavioral indicators, but students can have different profiles on all 3 dimensions. One common profile we see in schools is students who are high on behavioral engagement. They're kind of doing the work, but they're bored and they're not using deep strategies to learn and understand the material. So the most favorable outcomes are when we measure and look at all 3 dimensions. So why should we measure student engagement? And why might it make sense in an accountability system? Well, first, we know that especially if we take this multidimensional perspective, it gives a richer picture of how students are thinking and acting and feeling in school. And unfortunately, we know from some recent national studies that over 40 to 60% of students are high on indicators of disengagement. So we don't have a particularly engaged educational experience for many students. Another reason why engagement is an important thing to measure is we know, unlike some other factors, it is malleable, is that we can make changes to the social environment, to the academic environment, and we can increase engagement. So it's a root and it's a loci for effective intervention. We also know that engagement is necessary if students are really going to meet the academic standards. So they need to be engaged in all 3 ways. First, there's evidence that many schools are using engagement data as part of a school improvement effort. So they're using it to both plan, to build their capacity, and to engage in this ongoing and reflective school improvement. Fifth, many districts are using administrative data on disengagement, so students who are struggling early in their school careers, and using this data to guide them to appropriate interventions. So rather than waiting until students are dropping out of school, we're using data early to really understand which students are most at risk in targeting interventions. And finally, we know that engagement is predictive of a range of positive academic and non-academic outcomes. So what do we know about the research? We know, as I said, that when students are more engaged, they do better on a range of academic indicators. They have higher test scores, they have higher grades, they do better on assessments of cognitive skills. They report higher academic expectations. They're more likely to attend college, and they're less likely to drop out of school. So it is a route to more positive academic outcomes. Additionally, we know that when students are engaged, it also has positive non-academic outcomes, and many people are suggesting it might be a route to resiliency, a route to helping especially adolescents cope with kind of the challenges they face day-to-day in schools and classrooms. We know that when students are engaged, they report greater school belonging, they feel more connected to the institution, they report lower rates of depression, they're less likely to use substances, they're less likely to be delinquent, and they hang out with a more positive peer group. So not only is it a route to positive academic outcomes, it can be a route to positive youth development. So how do we measure engagement? I want to review ways that researchers have measured engagement and review ways that it has been measured in policy and practice. Now, there is some overlap, but some of the techniques that researchers use that address some of the problems with measurement are less applicable to a policy context. First, the most common way we've measured engagement in research has been surveys, and surveys where we ask students a series of like-or-style questions. They're usually on scales of 1 to 5, scales of 1 to 7, where there's questions about their behaviors, there are questions about their attitude, and their experience in school. In my research, and I will review some of this later, I've reviewed the quality of these survey measures and whether they are valid and reliable. And I think there are a few examples of survey measures that could pass the test for inclusion and accountability systems, but there's also large variation in the evidence to support that these are really reliable and valid measures. There are also a few examples of teacher report measures, and this is intended to use with younger students, where teachers respond to a series of questions about the student's behavior and emotion. We know less about the validity and reliability of these measures. Another approach to measuring engagement is to use administrative data that has already been collected and is available in school records. Examples of such indicators include attendance, truancy, credits earned, homework completion, problem behaviors, including suspension and expulsion. Now, there's a lot of benefits to using this data, which I'll go over, but one of the complications and variation in how this data has been measured and collected across schools, sometimes making comparisons difficult. The next 4 techniques I want to briefly review, which deal with some of the problems that with the measurement of these constructs, but are less applicable for use in an accountability system. For example, researchers have used observational methods where they either observe an individual child or they observe the whole child and record their level of engagement. Now, most of these observational measures focus on behavioral indicators, such as whether the student is on task, and the observer records this behavior during a defined period of time. Another way to measure engagement is to use performance tasks. So when students are completing a task, the observer records their behavioral, cognitive, and affective responses. For example, do they stay on task? Do they persist? What kind of strategies do they use? Often these are very structured tasks, and it's less clear whether how students respond in this structured situation is how they would be engaged in a more typical and complex classroom environment. That said, I do think this is an area where there's opportunities for the future to think about how performance assessments could be used in an accountability system. We're not there yet, but I do think that's an area of growth. Experience sampling techniques is a method that asks students to stop at certain times during the day. They're either beeped, they on a wristwatch or on a cell phone, and they record, they're asked a series of questions about their effort, their behavior, their attitudes. And one of the benefits of this method is it allows researchers to capture engagement in real-time settings. So what is the student feeling about engagement right at that specific moment, rather than retrospectively, which is a problem with survey methods. However, again, the feasibility of this method outside a research setting is less clear. Finally, there's a new area of research that is using physiological measures to assess behavioral and emotional engagement in real time. So we have some studies using EEG techniques to look at cognitive effort. There's also galvanic techniques where you wear a wristwatch and it measures your emotional arousal by measuring your sweat gland. Again, the benefits of this work is to capture engagement in real time, in real activities. I know the Gates Foundation has made some investments in this work, how we could collect this additional data in schools. But again, the feasibility of this method outside of a structured research setting is less clear. Now, in terms of what are we doing in policy centers, arenas to measure engagement? The most common measure in policy arenas is really using this administrative data on early warning signs. So in other words, we're kind of measuring behavioral disengagement, including measures of attendance, measures of chronic absenteeism, expulsions, and behavioral referrals. There also is examples in survey data. This tends to be many states. I know Connecticut is required to collect, every school district is required to administer school climate surveys. And I've looked at a lot of these surveys, and there's a lot of indicators that are very similar to engagement in terms of school connection, school attachment, interest, and enjoyment. And I know many other states have similar kind of surveys. So those are the most common ways to measure in policy arenas. So I want to review for the most common or administrative data and surveys, what are the benefits and what are some of the challenges. First, I want to review some of the benefits with using administrative data to measure engagement. First, the data is already being collected by the school. Second, we know it's passing the second criteria that this data is predictive of academic failure and dropping out of school. So we know that if we can get data early, we can intervene to kind of change trajectories. Third, these indicators have high face validity, which means that they're understood by practitioners. For example, if I went into schools and asked what absenteeism is, there'd be a lot stronger agreement than if we went into schools and had a conversation on what is school climate or school connectedness. Finally, these indicators tend to align with state and district priorities. For example, I know in my home state of Connecticut, an important policy emphasis has been reducing chronic absenteeism, and there's been a large state resources targeted around that goal. That said, despite these benefits, there are some challenges with using administrative data as an indicator of engagement. One concern is really school capacity to integrate. Often these are disparate sources of data into a school-based system. Second, there's concerns about potential biases in reporting of some of this data. For example, there's evidence that students of color and low-income students are being disproportionately suspended. So we have to be very careful when we look at this data to say, is this really valid and reliable indicators? There's also questions about whether some of these indicators can truly be compared across states. Finally, one of my concerns is these indicators really focuses on the behavioral aspects of engagement and disengagement. So we need to get students in classrooms. We need to keep, that's the first step, but that's not enough for deep learning. So if we really want to understand true learning, we need to also measure cognitive and emotional indicators. So surveys also have a lot of benefits, but they also face many challenges. One of the biggest benefits of surveys is easy to administer to large groups of students at a low cost, and it makes it easy to compare across groups. There tends to be less classroom disruption. We really want to measure emotional engagement. The most accurate and valid way to measure it is through survey indicators. Students are very good reporters on their emotions, and many districts are already administering many of these indicators as part of school climate surveys. Despite these benefits, there's a lot of challenges with surveys. First, engagement is context dependent. One of the beauties of engagement is it depends on the context. However, most survey measures are very general and not context specific. So, for example, they may ask, how interested are you in school, rather than how interested are you in this activity in a math class. So it's really based on the assumption that engagement is stable, and it can be measured outside of a learning task. Second, in responding to survey items, students need to aggregate their perceptions and reflect over multiple learning tasks. As a result, self-report methods often don't align with actual behaviors or strategies. So when we look at the link between observational data and survey measures, there's not a strong correspondence. And finally, there are concerns that individuals respond to surveys in socially desirable ways, leading to an upward bias in reporting. So can we really trust some of the data we're getting through survey methods? I want to review some sample survey items for each of the 3 dimensions of engagement. This list is based on a review I completed with colleagues at the Southeastern Regional Lab in 2011, and this report is free and available through REL. In this review, we identified 21 self-report survey and observational measures of engagement and looked across these measures for different items, usage, and psychometric properties. On the overhead are just some sample items for behavioral engagement. So you can see that there includes items about concentration, effort, participation, answering and asking questions, time on homework. There's a lot of different items, but I just wanted to give you a sense on how we ask some of these questions. And again, these questions can be asked at the class level in specific classes or at the school level. Then in terms of some sample emotional engagement survey items, there's questions about perceptions of belonging. So how do I feel like I am connected to my peers and my teacher? There's questions about both positive and negative emotions, and there's questions about enjoyment. And finally, cognitive survey items. There's questions about deep strategy use versus a shallow strategy use. So deep strategies are the strategies that really help you learn and remember the material versus a shallow strategy where it's more about memorization. There's also questions about persistence. How do students persist, especially when things are difficult? And then there's questions about self-regulation and metacognition. How do I plan how I think through material? And I want to just talk a little bit about some additional issues if we're going to use surveys in an accountability system that we need to be cognizant of. First, in our 2011 review of engagement measures, as I said, we found large variation in the extent to which surveys had information that's reliable, or would you get the same response on multiple administrations? And is it valid? Or does the survey operate in the way you would expect? So we don't have that many surveys who actually meet this criteria. Second, we have very little information on whether the surveys work the same or differently across different populations. So do they work the same by race, by gender, by special education status? If items mean different things to different groups of students, then these are not really valid indicators. Now, some initial work my colleagues and I are doing suggests that many of these survey measures would fit this criteria, but we still need more information. Third, self-report measures can suffer from a frame of reference problem. So what that means is when responding to survey items, you have to come up with some comparison group. Who am I going to compare myself to? And research suggests that the more competent an individual is, so the higher they are achieving, the more stringently they judge themselves. So this can result in an interesting paradox where some of the most engaged students actually give themselves lower ratings than disengaged students because they're comparing themselves to a more engaged group. So this may lead to inaccurate comparisons, so you really need to take into account the frame of reference problem. And finally, an even more problematic result is the potential for unexpected negative outcomes as a result of accountability pressure. Anytime you add something to an accountability system, it changes the nature of that data. We've seen this happen with achievement test scores. So there's a question, will schools help coach students on how you should respond to a survey item, or even more problematic, will schools take this data? Now, I just want to very briefly talk about the California Collaborative on District Reform, because that is an excellent opportunity to think about on a large scale of how a large district is really trying to address measuring non-cognitive factors. In 2013, as a result of an NCLB waiver, 6 large districts in California developed a comprehensive accountability system that includes indicators of social and emotional learning, culture and climate, and engagement. These indicators right now are representing 40% of their accountability system, with 60% represented by traditional academic indicators. So they have pilot data, and that's some of the resources. Because of time, I can't go into that, but there's really interesting pilot data testing some of these reliability, validity, frame of reference questions. There's also some interesting case studies coming out on what does it mean to use this kind of data in a system. But what they did is they used surveys to collect additional information on growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. And growth mindset is the belief that you can develop your abilities through effort. Self-efficacy is your confidence in your abilities to succeed. Self-management is your ability to regulate your emotion and behavior. And social awareness is your ability to take the perspective of and empathize with others. They also use some of their existing culture and climate surveys where they included measures of belonging, which has indicators. Those indicators are very similar to what I would consider engagement. They have measures of school safety and perceived fairness. And then how they measure engagement, or how they report measuring engagement, is through behavioral indicators. So they look at measures of absenteeism and suspension. So all those materials are kind of what we're learning through this collaborative will be available on the web. So finally, I just want to conclude with some questions that districts, schools should ask before selecting a measure. First, schools need to consider what data are you already collecting to measure engagement, and whether you have capacity to collect additional data and integrate it with existing systems. The California districts have been able to collect this additional survey data because they have extensive support from researchers and technical assistant providers, but many districts do not have this capacity. Next, schools need to consider how the data will be used. There are a variety of reasons. So I want to, kind of my message is collect engagement data. There's a lot of good reasons to collect it. I'm not sure yet. We have to be very cautious about including it in an accountability system, but there's a lot of reasons to collect it, to do needs assessment, to understand how are schools doing, students, teachers, and that can be really used to target specific supports and interventions. There's also really powerful information of how we use it in school improvement. So think about a variety of ways to use this data. Fourth, schools need to consider who they'll share the data with and how they'll communicate it to different stakeholders. We know that teachers, parents, public officials, they often hold different perspectives on the purpose and use of this data, so we really need to think through the communication. Districts also should consider if you're going to use a survey measure, what are the psychometric properties? So is this measure reliable? Is it consistent across multiple administrations? If we ask students a lot of questions about the same idea, are they answering it in similar ways? Is this measure valid? Does it measure what we said it was going to measure, and it is related to outcomes in expected ways? So if we're looking at an engagement measure, it should predict achievement. It should predict some of these other outcomes that people have looked at. And then we need to think about, can this measure be used to compare across schools? And how have we addressed the frame of reference problem? Now, the core districts have done their analysis suggests that frame of reference isn't really as much of an issue in those districts, but that is something to consider. Okay, so I want to use recommendations for measuring engagement. So consider data that's already being collected by your school, either through these administrative data or school climate surveys. I also know in my district, the school climate survey was a great opportunity to add a few additional engagement items. We already had many of those items, but we've added a few additional engagement items so we can chart engagement over time and look how does it change, how does it vary. And then I encourage you if you're going to look at engagement, to look at our review. We've made it in a way that's very user-friendly, that lays out each of the measures, lays out what are they trying to measure, how have they used it, what populations has it being used on, how strong is the evidence to support reliability and validity. So it's a great resource for schools. I also encourage districts to consider this is a real opportunity. While I'm concerned about some of the issues with accountability, I am so excited by the opportunity to think about data in different ways and the potential for engagement data really being used to inform school improvement. There's great opportunities for how teachers becoming more data informed, using that to inform their practice, think about their students in different ways, and it really presents an opportunity. And then finally, I encourage you to collect data for formative purposes rather than thinking only in terms of accountability systems. And as you collect this data, over time, it may make sense to include it in an accountability system, but there's real opportunities to use it in a way to really inform practice. So thank you again. As I said, I have 2 emails. I'm happy to answer a lot of questions now, but if districts or have more additional questions, I can be reached at both of these emails. The JFred is the email that I'm using most often now, but my new email is also available. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Jenny. Terrific. Lots and lots of information, and we're getting some terrific questions here. So please keep them coming to the audience here. I will highlight a few for you here and then pay attention to them as more come through. The first question I want to pose is, how have you seen student engagement data being used to shift or to improve teacher practices in the classroom? You mentioned a couple times that it can be used as a formative assessment, has been, should be used in that way. It's being used as a school quality measure. It could be used for these sort of school quality indicators for ESSA. How then has it been translated to either professional development interventions or as specific feedback that's helpful for classroom-based educators to think about shifting their practices? What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, there's some Jim Connell and his First Things First has kind of developed a whole intervention around using engagement data, so that's a good model to look at how they've used it. There's, of course I'm blanking, but there are, and I'm happy to share that. I'll put those resources online. There's a whole project out of, where are they out of? Where they work very one-on-one with teachers to help them like evaluate their practice and look at data. And getting teachers to think about data in a way, a positive way. We kind of think of data in a negative way, but thinking about, what's working in your classroom, what's not, how are students perceiving the environment when you're putting in an intervention. So there's both data that's really been, engagement data that's been built into intervention systems, but there's also, and I can't believe I'm flaking on this, but I will, there's a whole, they do professional development, they do training on how to use engagement data in the classroom in a very positive way. So I've seen that. I do a lot, I work with teachers and they don't often, there's kind of an assumption a student is engaged because they're sitting still, they're behaving. We don't really know. I mean, that's why we need to think, what is the student thinking? Are they using deep strategies? And even with my teachers that, they give very short kind of these 5 to 10, engagement items to see how students are doing. They use it as an opportunity to have a conversation with a student to see how that student is doing. There's also a lot of work. I think the early warning signs is one of the most powerful ways data is being used. I know they're doing a lot of that in Connecticut where they are creating these kind of data hubs where they're collecting information on achievement, is the student behind on credit, attendance, truancy, and they're using that to identify students who are at risk. My colleague Sandy Christensen, who I'm doing a lot of work with, has developed kind of the check and connect model that really uses that kind of data to say, let's check in, how are students doing? And then using that data, if we identify that a student is having a problem, then connect them to a mentor, connect them to resources. So there's really powerful ways we can use data to get teachers to think differently, to get appropriate interventions in it, to use it to kind of inform professional development. And I will put that, I know I will think of that organization right after we get off this call, and I'll make sure those resources are available on the web.
Terrific. So we will upload those links and resources when this webinar gets recorded and then uploaded to the website. And Melanie has just added in the chat function below where those resources will be found, and we'll talk about that at the end here. So second question, and this is somewhat related to the first one. Do you have any suggestions for how schools and systems would try to strike a balance between using engagement data for formative purposes versus using it for accountability? And the sort of subtext of that question is, are those competing goals, formative purposes versus accountability purposes? How would you answer that?
I don't think they're necessarily competing goals. Now, that said, you may be using different types of data in an accountability system. I think the attendance, I'm not surprised, chronic absenteeism and attendance, I think those data make sense right now in an accountability system. I think there are a few surveys that would meet criteria, but most are not ready yet. And I think you can use data to talk about practice in a way, and that doesn't have to go against a kind of accountability framework. I think it's different than achievement test scores. I think these are kind of data that really allow for conversation.
Using data to talk about practices, which could end up in accountability measures, but can also end up really powerfully in formative classroom level and school level changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just had, I think our accountability system has made data seem negative. when data is just how am I doing and what can I do differently and what's working, what's not, how can I target interventions more effectively? And I think engagement data really lends itself to that question. That doesn't mean it also can't be used at accountability level, but that's really what the purpose of it is. What am I doing right and what am I not, and how are students responding, and which contexts are they more or less engaged, and how can we better target interventions?
Yeah, so that leads me to ask then, this may be sort of a hair-splitting question both for researchers and for practitioners who are looking to parse some of these concepts that often feel like they've all collapsed into one. But how do you define engagement as different from other factors such as student agency, motivation, voice, and is it important to draw some bright lines between those constructs and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, I'll start, I think we have too many constructs. If you really look, in some ways, researchers can argue about the differences. I don't think in some ways they're that different. That said, I think what engagement is different, at least from many of the motivational constructs, is that engagement assumes you're engaged in something. So motivation is really driven as an individual kind of, I feel confident, or I have agency, versus my engagement is, if you're really doing engagement right, my engagement is tied to a task, is tied to a teacher, is tied to a context, and you can't separate those. So in some ways, I think there's too much hair splitting, and in some ways, for policy purposes, it doesn't really matter, these distinctions, as much as it matters in the research community. But one thing I find very appealing about engagement over some of these other constructs is it really depends on the environment.
That's helpful. This does lead to another question just posed by Frank LeBlanco, one of our students at the Center Distinguished Fellows, who asks, and again, this really gets to some core distinctions that might be important. When working with teachers, how do you help find the balance or make meaning of the difference between engagement and compliance? How do you discern those things? Because I think in many cases, in my own research and in lots of the publications with which I'm most familiar, teachers in schools are rightfully and somewhat wrongfully emphasize student compliance. And how might we collapse those two, and how might we differentiate those two?
Yeah, so I wrote a book for teachers, and one of the things I tried to do in the book is weave different cases. And I try to talk about the behaviorally engaged but nothing else kid. So that's your kid who's going to do everything you want to do. But when we look, but they're bored, they're not using deep strategies, that leads to much poorer outcomes. You don't have as good of achievement outcomes. You don't have some of these deeper learning outcomes. So I use these cases to try and get teachers to think about different kinds of students they have in their classroom, and thinking that engagement, that on all three of these dimensions, there are different profiles of engagement, and ideally we want students who are more than just compliant. In some ways, a truly engaged student might not be totally compliant, because engagement means talking and being, true engagement in real classrooms means I'm talking with my peers, I'm sharing ideas. It's not a quiet classroom, it's a classroom where there's much deeper learning. So getting teachers to kind of, question some of the assumptions they make about, what does it mean? So just because a student is compliant, we can't assume that they're interested in learning, and we can't assume they're actually deep learning. They might be thinking about something, what they're going to do tonight, or be with their friend. I mean, our interviews with kids are like, I just pretend to be engaged for teachers. That's all. I'm going to play the game. I'm going to pretend it. And so unless teachers really interrogate these other aspects of engagement, we're just going to get a lot of kids who go through the motion and pretend and kind of play the game. And I mean, that's better than not being in school, but that's not going to lead to the real positive outcomes we hope to see from our classes.
Yeah, that's important. And I think that speaks to this next question then, which helps us to think about how we might capture more authentic or increasingly authentic versions of engagement in classroom settings. And the question is, do you see a role for direct classroom observation and research on non-cognitive skills? And if you do, how have you seen that used to inform understanding of our validity of more standardized measures? What would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think observations are very powerful, but unfortunately, I think observations, at least in the engagement field, now I know less about observation. I know there is some work on how we're observing it in the social and emotional learning field. I know in the engagement field, most of the observations are still pretty behavioral, and we don't necessarily know if we're getting at the deep learning. That said, there, you know, I didn't include these here, but there's some powerful ways to do think alouds where you have a child kind of talk through a task and report what they're doing that can get at some of these deeper learnings. That's kind of an observational strategy. I do think performance tasks are an area that really has potential for growth and how students work through different kind of tasks and thinking about how they do it. But right now our observational methods are pretty good at getting behavior. We haven't quite figured out how to get some of these other indicators.
Yeah, so this is sort of a magic wand question that goes to the performance task issue. What would it take to move the field toward a wider use of performance tasks as an accountability measure, not just for informational purposes and for dissertations and research articles, but to actually use it in order to make decisions about best practices and to use school quality measures? If you could wave your magic wand, what would we be doing better to use performance tasks, particularly as it informs engagement?
Well, we need a better sense of how you actually code these tasks. So what are you looking for? What are the indicators? We need better kind of reports on what does it mean to look at these indicators. So we need a better agreement on, you know, some standardized performance tasks that people use. I've seen a few studies that have tried to really like classify how do you observe a student, but we are so not there yet. So there needs to be a real serious research investment in doing, you know, kind of learning how to code these kind of tasks, coming up with a set task that kind of can be used across context, and then figuring out how to, we still have a long way to go. I think there's a lot of, I'm growing over time of thinking there's so much more potential in this area, but the research is pretty new.
Right, right. With that in mind, have you seen the use of peer nomination or peer evaluation in assessing non-cognitive skills? And if so, has that been done with enough rigor that it could be scaled?
I don't know if the person could say what they really mean about peer nomination and peer evaluation. I'm not familiar in the engagement literature about how to do that, but if I had a little more context, I could think about if there's other literature.
Right, yeah, I'm assuming it means that a research methodology where the students' peers are nominating those who are really engaged and those who are less engaged, so that you get more of a social network analysis of kids' performances and their behaviors. But I'm making an assumption there. It looks like Jim Alamute is saying yes, that is the interpretation. Yeah. Have you seen that used?
I mean, yeah. So there's really interesting work on you know, peers' level of engagement is very you know, that we tend to choose similar peers in terms of engagement, but I haven't seen it used in a systematic way in terms of peer nomination. Now, there's a lot of social networks. My colleague, Allison Ryan, that's kind of what she does, and that's something she's thinking about, but I don't think we're there yet. But, you know, if that's something
your colleague,
Allison Ryan, who's at University of Michigan, she's kind of the leading authority on peers and engagement. And so if anybody is doing it, she would know.
She'd be the one. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So another question, this is another methodological question, but how attentive are engagement survey instruments in capturing cultural differences and how cultural differences may map onto issues of inequity as students with various social locations experience schooling and their level of engagement from the institution, from their teachers, from their peers differently. So particularly, as you mentioned, belonging, safety, fairness, and I would add to that microaggressions, discriminatory experiences, disproportionate disciplinary experiences. So are engagement survey instruments drilling into those particular phenomena? And if so, what are we learning? And if not, is that an area for growth?
The answer is no. For the most part, no. Now, that said, you know, that question is, do we know if engagement measures are very general, and they're kind of given for a lot of different populations. And so I don't think there's good surveys that really are capturing some of these cultural differences. Now, some work that my colleagues and I have done is when you look at across how students in different populations respond to these surveys, they tend to be similar. But that's not the same as a good survey measure that really addresses some of these constructs. So no, we're not there.
So again, an advancing edge of the field that needs to be explored. That's good to know. Another question from one of our JFS staff is, do you have an opinion on the pair inventory or the Search Institute surveys, both of which have some engagement issues connected within them?
I don't know which one's the pair inventory. I know the Search Institute. I don't think the Search Institute items are very good.
Yeah. They're too macro level. They don't drill down enough into student individual experiences. Yeah, I mean, I think we didn't even actually the Search Institute was one of the things we thought about for including. Like the report, we went through hundreds and hundreds of different measures, and it didn't meet even our criteria for inclusion. And I don't remember why. But I'm not sure I know the pair. Good. Okay. Well, we will look into it.
But that said, even though like the Search Institute, Child Trends has some, in their database, they have a small engagement scale. That's one of the challenges is because I don't like it as a researcher, doesn't mean it doesn't serve a policy and practice purpose. I think the items are too general. I don't think they capture the multidimensional construct. But again, I mean, when you're including it in with many other items, that might be the best you can get.
Yeah. I've just a side point to that there are multiple times where in working with building level leaders and with classroom educators where they have asked me, what is a valid and reliable instrument I can use in my classroom to assess my students' engagement on a daily basis? And I'm like, well, you don't need that as much. You're not writing a dissertation. You don't need to, show impact factors and your p-values and stuff as much. You could have incredibly valid and rich information with a regular practice of using exit tickets or getting kids to fill out quick surveys or doing a sampling technique and doing some focus group interviews at your school. It could be rich data that would inform all kinds of important reforms at your school that wouldn't technically rise to the level of validity and reliability that a researcher working for NSF would need, but would be really important for the school level. So I think it's important to separate what a teacher and what an educator and what an administrator may need to inform practices and what, to be colloquial, the nerds need in order to establish their p-values for, other reporting requirements. So that may not level, go ahead, Ruby, if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, Eric, I went a bit like that. One of the projects you guys are funding on the math agency and the exit tickets. I mean, I think that's a really powerful way to get daily data or, weekly data. And I know just talking to kids, what are you engaging? You can interview kids. I mean, that's really informed. Sometimes we don't even sit down and just talk to kids. What was engaging about that? What wasn't? That can really inform.
So that speaks to two remaining questions that I want to ask, and this gets right to the level of practices. And given your level of sophistication from the research side and your work with teachers in schools and how you've written for those audiences, what to you are the most promising practices known to positively impact student engagement?
Yeah, so I think there's practices both that are practices at the task level and practices at the social relationship level. So at the task level, I'm a strong believer in as much as possible, we can use more open-ended tasks, more authentic tasks, more project-based learning where students have to, as much as we can model how learning really happens outside of classrooms, we know that's related to higher engagement. So they have opportunities to work with their peers on projects over extended periods of time, ask questions, share their feedback in multiple formats. That we know that that relates to very powerful engagement. Now I could do a whole other webinar on implementation. There's some challenges with the implementation of that, but with good scaffolding, that really can lead to we have really strong evidence of a more open-ended kind of task focus, a more authentic, more relevant to the the student's life outside the classroom as being engaging. There's also the importance of the social dynamics. So we need to build both in terms of how we do professional development, in the terms of the structures with teachers, and in terms of having an adequate support network of non-educators, school psychologists, school staff, but addressing relationships, because positive relationships are key to engagement. And we know that the more disengaged kids tend to elicit more negative reactions from teachers, from staff, that further perpetuates some of their problems. So we need to really address the quality of relationships in a variety of ways, through structure, through professional development, through building that into curriculum, and peer relationships. So both addressing, creating a classroom community. There's a lot of interventions around community, addressing kids who are rejected, actively by their peers. That has a real negative effect on interventions. I'm putting a plug in, and the book won't be done until next year, but we're compiling, my colleagues Sandy Christensen and Amy Reschley and I are writing a book on the best student engagement interventions, specifically targeting kids who are disengaged. So looking at what do we know from the research at the task level, at the school level, at the community level, at the parent level, and I could do a whole other webinar on what we know on that. So we have pretty strong evidence on, some of these interventions at kind of high quality. A question of the scaling is another issue, but we do know we do have some strong studies with really high quality content.
So to add plug on plug, I just want to make sure the audience here knows that as soon as Jenny's book and with her colleagues comes out in a year hence, that you will be able to find it linked to and talked about at our website, because we would love to shine a light on that and make sure that more people get it. And I know if I were still a classroom educator, I would have devoured that volume. So I'm sure that'll be a huge add to the field. One last question, and then yeah, go ahead, please, Jenny.
Oh, yeah, and then I also have a book for teachers, that 8 Myths of Student Disengagement, that has a lot of these, in it too. That really,
Indeed.
Teachers are using it now, and schools are using it in professional development to think about their engagement. So that's another resource that we can link to.
For sure, we will link to that. One last question, then I'll give it to you for some final words here. The last question is, and this just goes right to it, how would you respond to an educator, an administrator, a community member, a policymaker who says these students are not engaged or these students don't care about learning? What's your 2-sentence or 1-sentence response when somebody says that within earshot of you?
Yeah, so I think that it is harder to engage some students. So we have to acknowledge the individual challenges that students bring to a classroom, but engagement is malleable, and the context matters. And we know from intervention studies that we can engage even the most disengaged kids. So you know that even kids who don't care, we think they don't care, there are contexts where they are really engaged. So we have to understand those contexts and figure out how we can make more of those environments available in school. So I think we need to have students take responsibility for their learning. I'm not denying that, but we need to also acknowledge the role that context plays.
Indeed. Any last words before I thank you and the team?
And I'm happy, like, if I didn't answer somebody's question or people have additional questions on resources, I'm happy. Please feel free to email me. I'm happy to, try to answer your question or connect you to other resources. Fantastic.
Dr. Fredricks, your insights, contributions to the field are way too long to list here, and it's great that you've provided the time and the resources for us here to dive deeper into how engagement can be used as a formative and summative assessment and how it might better be integrated into states and districts' attempts to be in compliance with ESSA's fifth indicator requirements. So wealth of information here, much appreciated. Please note, we will be uploading this website and its uploading this webinar and its recording to our website in the weeks to come. You can find that at the Student Centered Learning Research Collaborative's website that's mentioned in the chat function there. As always, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for how the Research Collaborative can continue to serve policymakers, practitioners, and researchers across the field, across the states, we would love to hear from you. And again, I want to thank Dr. Fredricks for her insights and her time today, and also want to thank Melanie Mulvey, Program Manager at Jobs for the Future, for setting everything up for this webinar today. And with that, I will conclude 10 to 15 seconds early and wish everyone a happy Tuesday and rest of the week. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye.